Good morning, everybody. Before I introduce Jonathan or do a brief bio and then we dive into the book, I just want to say what I say every morning to get the day started, which is get up, it's another day in which to excel. Where's that from, Jonathan?
That's what Jimmy Carter's father said to him, and he said to his own sons. He didn't say it to Amy in quite the same way.
Yeah. So imagine getting hit with that in the face in the morning every time you got up. Anyway, I'm delighted to talk with Jonathan about his new book. Well, it's not new anymore, but about his latest book, I guess I should say. Jonathan has written about Carter, 2 books on Obama, a book on FDR, but I first came to know him as a columnist for Newsweek, in which he wrote incisive columns framing the political landscape, which was very irritating because I worked at Time. We spent a fair amount of time on the road, and Jonathan always had a sense of the context of politics that was larger than the politics the way we were looking at it as day-to-day political reporters, which was to gather tiny little nuts like squirrels. And Jonathan always had a way to look at the larger political questions, more policy-focused than some of us who were obsessed with the horse race. And so I've always admired his work, and that's particularly true with this book. He also turns out to have also won an Emmy for a documentary about 2 heroes of the news business, newspaper writers, and then also somehow was a co-producer of a comedy series on Amazon. So anyway, he's got a lot going on. But I want to start first, Jonathan, because we're obviously all thinking about Jimmy Carter now that he's in hospice. But you came upon this project long before the current obsession, obviously, with Jimmy Carter. What got you interested in the Carter presidency, and what questions were you trying to answer when you first started the project?
Well, first, thanks to everybody for coming. James Carville's across the way, and he's a lot funnier than I am, so it's nice for you to be here. I had been an intern in the Carter White House in 1978, in the summer of '78. But then 2 years later, I had actually been a volunteer in Ted Kennedy's challenge to Carter for the Democratic nomination, which was one of the stupider things I ever did, because in retrospect, it was really pretty crazy for Kennedy to challenge a perfectly good Democratic president. And then in all the years at Newsweek, I only interviewed Carter once on a Habitat for Humanity site, talked to him about the Middle East. So I really didn't know him. And then, as I mentioned at the panel yesterday, and if I'm repeating myself a little bit, how many here were at yesterday's panel? Okay, so a few of you. So you've heard this story before, but my fellow panelist, Gary Ginsberg, has a book club that I'm in New York, and Jimmy Carter was a guest because we're reading a book about Camp David that a New Yorker writer wrote. And after an evening with Jimmy Carter, I thought, my God, there's got to be more to this guy than lousy president, great ex-president. He was so sharp. He just turned 90, and it was pretty clear that his human rights policy had led to democratic transformation around the globe. And it turned out that my editor at Simon & Schuster was also Walter Isaacson's editor, and many others here, the late, great Alice Mayhew, was Jimmy Carter's editor. So she loved this idea, and she smoothed the way, and I got a tremendous amount of access to Carter and his entire family. And so that was sort of the original impetus to try to answer the question of whether the cliche about him was accurate or not. I had a pretty good idea that it wasn't. I knew that he was a very complex guy that, as Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, said, he had 3 smiles.
Yeah.
He had the big public smile that everybody knows, and that is in some ways a political smile that he does to win favor. And then he has a tight smile where he takes his icy blue eyes and he bores them into you, and he's sort of smiling, and that's when you know he's pissed off. And the temperature in the room drops about 25 degrees. And then below that, he has a genuine smile when he or somebody else has gotten off a funny line. And so I knew there was a complexity here. I knew he was enormously intelligent. And then after I started working on the book, shortly after I started, the contrast to Trump was just so stark, and he was just beginning to run for president. And so I came to see him as a relief, a vacation from Donald Trump.
For the country or
for
for
me,
you?
For me, selfishly.
Yeah.
For me, like
Yeah.
every time like I couldn't take it anymore, I'm covering, Trump, I could just go back into my research and feel almost comforted by learning about this life of a very flawed but very decent man.
That's interesting. I want to get to that at the end if we have time, because there were some people who had the opposite feeling, which was to study a person who was so committed to telling the truth, who lived by a personal code, who felt norms bound you, not just for the here and now, but for eternity, was such a contrast to the current moment that it made them sad and depressed because you weren't seeing that in the current life. But I'm not going to let you answer that, but you can.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted people to know that there were others in politics in our recent history who could be decent and president at the same time.
Let me ask you though, let's go back to the beginning. What does it mean to come from Plains, or that Jimmy Carter came from Plains? Well, around Plains.
Jimmy Carter has led what I think of as an epic American life. And so Plains, Georgia, has a population of 650 people. And if you visit there, which I recommend, it is like going to a foreign country. I mean, there are places in Louisiana that you get that same feeling, but it's just so different than urban America, and especially for somebody of Jimmy Carter's age. So I think of Jimmy Carter as having lived in 3 centuries. He was born in 1924, he's 98, but it might as well have been the 19th century. They had no electricity, no running water, no mechanized farm equipment, and they were the most affluent relatively in the area. Mm-hmm. They had a car, and they had a radio, and
he was born in a hospital, which...
He was born in a hospital because by a kind of a quirk, he was the first president ever born in a hospital. A hospital, which is now long gone, had moved to Plains, and his mother was a nurse at the hospital, and she, a couple years later, delivered a baby named Rosalind Smith, and she brought her toddler, Jimmy, over to see the new baby that she had delivered, and they've known each other for the 95 years since, and they've been married for 77 of them. But the life there on the farm, and Jimmy Carter's first ambition was to be like his father, a farmer, and he has always been tremendously ambitious for himself, but also for others. And this is the key. Most people, their ambition, and his was fiercely driven guy, but was always for something broader. So he's raised in this environment where his father is a white supremacist and won't let any black person after puberty enter through the front door of their home. And his mother is a nurse who takes care of black patients for free, but she's so busy all the time that he was really raised in many ways by an illiterate black woman sharecropper named Rachel Clark. And she taught him his love of nature, which he grew up to be one of our greatest environmental presidents, signed 15 major pieces of environmental legislation, and also a lot about his faith. So he really had these 3 parents, and he always took more after his mother in terms of his racial attitudes. So when he goes off to the Naval Academy, which was his first ambition to be in the Navy, like his uncle, who had been taken prisoner by the Japanese, and they thought he was dead. His wife got a new husband. It turned out he was alive. It's a whole other crazy story. But very close to this guy, and that fires his original ambition to get out of Plains and go north to Annapolis. And when he's there, he's very supportive of the first black midshipman, and he has these really unusual ideas about race. But then he comes back to planes. And when his father dies in 1952, and he's thrust back into this world, only now, within a couple years, it's a post Brown versus Board of Education culture. So you might think, oh, that's good. The Supreme Court just ruled against school desegregation. No, it wasn't. It created this enormous backlash, and you had this kind of new Jim Crow. They sometimes talk about now being new Jim Crow. They were moving like rapidly backwards. Right. And so you had a period that he encounters as a young adult of what can only be described as white terrorism. The local sheriff made Bull Connor look like a nice guy, used electrified cattle prods on 13-year-old black girls. We're talking just a horrific circumstances, which he's not bearing the brunt of, but he has to duck.
Yeah.
And duck for cover, or his business will be destroyed and he won't be able to go into politics.
I want to ask you about Admiral Rickover, who comes in between this, but since we're on race, let's stay there for right now. Keep telling this story, because you at one point compare him to Martin Luther King's definition of the moderate white ally and what a danger that is to the black. Yeah. I mean, the Jimmy Carter, as you describe it, you talk about complexity. He would not be before his inaugural speech as governor, would not be in the list of brave people who spoke out in this moment. So describe Jimmy Carter in that period, just as in the context of what you were just saying.
So he assumes all of his father's civic responsibilities and saves the family business, and that's his focus, but does not even begin to implement Brown versus Board of Education in his school. But they don't even, I looked over the minutes, they didn't even discuss it, much less implement it. And the reason was Georgia had just passed a law saying if even one black child goes to a school, that school automatically closes, automatically. And the governor's slogan at the time was "No, not one." And so he makes a decision that he wants to run for the Georgia State Senate to improve education in his area, not integrate it, just improve it. And then he runs twice for governor, and first time in 1966 as kind of a more liberal candidate, although that's a relative term. He's beaten by Lester Maddox, famous racist, infamous racist, and he has he goes into a period of depression. He goes on a mission in the North, door to door for Jesus, and has a kind of a born-again experience where he, at one point, they come upon a brothel, and he tries to convert the madam, the brothel, unsuccessfully. But he's made a decision that he's going to do what it takes to become governor the next time in 1970. And what that meant was basically pandering on race. And so he says that he'll invite George Wallace in if he's elected governor to address the Georgia state legislature. And he pays a visit on the founder of the White Citizens Council, which sends a signal to all the rural voters, vote for Carter. And so this was the low point of his whole career. And I remember at one point, I spent a lot of time talking to him about many different things, but on this one, at one point he said, quietly, softly, not in an intimidating way, he said, "Are we done talking about this yet?" I said, "President Carter, we're not." Yeah. And he finally said, "Look, I never claimed to be part of the civil rights movement, and I had a decision to make. I could be governor of Georgia, or I could be an outspoken supporter of civil rights, and I chose to be governor of Georgia." But what's interesting about this is, because remember, all this time, he and his wife have been secret integrationists. And at one time, a little earlier, he tried to integrate his church. By integrate, I don't mean like let black folks be members of the church, let them cross the threshold of the church. And he lost. He was a deacon in the church, but
badly, right?
Badly,
yeah.
Lost badly. And then if he had broken this boycott of this interracial farm in the area and sold to this farm, which later evolved into a little organization called Habitat for Humanity, which you've heard of. If he had broken the boycott, his business would have been dynamited, as was another business that broke the boycott. So this is the environment he's coming out of. What was interesting is, so he's running for Georgia, this time, governor, this time successfully, and Vernon Jordan is for his opponent. And he comes up to him and sort of complains mildly, and Carter says to him, "Watch what I do, not what I'm saying." And indeed, there's a great story behind this, but moments after he takes the oath of office as governor, he says the time for racial discrimination is over. And this is on the front page of the New York Times, and this makes him the voice of the New South, and he's on the cover of Time magazine. And
a very radical move given how he got elected. Just
very radical.
Yeah.
So I actually, for the first time, because the press missed it, I found out there was a walkout. A bunch of his old colleagues from the state senate, they walked out of his inaugural. And the black voters in attendance were, he said, "What?" He said, "What?" They couldn't believe it. Yeah. And then he made good on it by integrating Georgia government. He hangs Dr. King's portrait in the Georgia state capitol as the Klan is outside, and becomes very friendly with Dr. Daddy King, who becomes an important supporter. So even though he'd never met Martin Luther King, my sister, who's here today, she and I met him in 1966 when we were kids in Chicago. Like, it wasn't that hard to meet him, and he's just down the street in Atlanta. Yes. Never met him when he was alive, but very close to Daddy King and the rest of the King family after he becomes governor. And then he spends the second half of his life making up for what he did not do in the first half of his life.
So one more road to go down before we get to his presidency, and we'll have to decide on time whether we go into the 1976 race, which is an amazing race, but there's also the presidency to handle. Admiral Rickover, because Jimmy Carter has this code, this sense of behavior, and part of it comes from the father, part of it comes from where he comes from, part of it comes from Admiral Rickover. Tell us briefly about Admiral Rickover, and in particular, as you write in the book, a character like Rickover couldn't exist today. I mean, by any stretch. But was super influential in Jimmy Carter's life.
Super influential. So I once asked Colin Powell about the end of the Cold War, and he said, Admiral Rickover basically won the Cold War. Well, okay, that's quite a statement. So Rickover was responsible for the most exciting tech project of the middle part of the 20th century, which was taking a nuclear power plant and putting it on a submarine and later aircraft carriers, and before they were on land. Yeah. Okay, imagine that. No, nuclear powered on land. And so and a fascinating story, which I tell a little bit of, how he did this, but so his program was the most elite in the entire military, and Carter got tired of his naval assignments and applied successfully. He was already a submariner to get into the Admiral Rickover's program, and Rickover was, who I interviewed once when I was a young journalist, famously curmudgeonly guy, and his interviews nowadays, he'd be fired in 2 seconds. Eventually did under Reagan, they finally fired him, but he was always protected by Congress, and the president and the naval brass always wanted to fire him because he was so disruptive. But when he would interview people, he would say to them, go open the window, and the window would be nailed shut, and he'd want to see how they reacted. Or if they mentioned a wife, he'd say, do you have kids? He'd say, yeah. And he'd say, I don't want any bird hatchers. You're going to be too busy. you're out. I'm not hiring you, right? He would sometimes, because Carter actually did have kids by the time he was hired. So, but if you didn't answer the questions in the right way, and sometimes he'd put you in a closet, lock you in there to see how you reacted to that. Just unbelievable stuff. And so in Carter's case, and this changed his life and it led to the title of my book, he's going through the interview. Rickover is asking him these intense questions. Carter says he's interested in classical music. Rickover says what? He says, Mahler's, which movement? Why that movement? Why do you like? Impossible to answer kinds of questions. And Carter thinks it's going really badly, and then it gets worse. Rickover says, where did you stand in your class at the Naval Academy? And Carter says very proudly, 59th in a class of 850. And Rickover says, did you do your best? And Carter says, who could have been first because he's a brilliant guy. Not always. And Rickover says, why not your best? And he turns around, the interview's over, and Carter's out. And he calls Rosalind and says, I didn't make it. But Rickover appreciated his honesty, and he took him into the program. And I think for the rest of his life, everything he does, he always has to be all in. He never, even when he's fishing, he's never on Miller time. He has to catch the most fish. He's incredibly competitive. So right now he's in hospice, right? So there's this humorist named Art Buchwald who set the record for being in hospice the longest. He was in hospice for 11 months. And I was joking with Jerry Rafshoon, who was a top aide to Carter, that we were agreeing that Carter's trying to break Art Buchwald's record. And so I called my book his very best because I think that he was all in all the time. And then I put the Andy Warhol on the cover because until now, people thought of Carter as very uncool. But in 1976, he was super cool.
Oh my God, the
And I
Allman
wanted
Brothers,
to remind people
hanging out with Bob Dylan. And,
yeah.
The reason I wanted to talk about Rickover and his father, and we maybe can't address it, is here you have two people who set the structure for his life, arguably, neither of whom could exist in contemporary American life right now. And as we think about the Carter presidency and Jimmy Carter himself as being driven by a set of principles and norms and standards, a lot of that architecture was put in place by a previous generation that we see as being, for a number of different reasons, part of the worst of America. So we can just leave it at that, but it's part, because I want to jump to his presidency, but it's to the extent that he stood by his standards and still stands by them, the architects of those standards were objectionable people in a lot of ways.
They were, but Carter was part of the transition. So he took the federal government, for instance, from tokenism to true diversity. He appointed 5 times as many women to the federal bench as all of his predecessors combined, and the figures are comparable for black judges. And so, in some ways, he was anticipating this new world. But you're right that, in other ways, it can be hard for people to transcend that. But I think one of the amazing things about Jimmy Carter is older people, they remember the bad stuff and his political failures, and he was a political failure. Younger people, they sense that his values are much more in alignment with theirs, not just because I think most of them don't even know that he became a Bernie Sanders supporter eventually, but, which is a long transition from Scoop Jackson, who he nominated at the 1972 convention.
And being to the right of Edward Kennedy in 1980.
Yes, yeah. But I think younger people sense that he actually is that transition to the world of their values, and that, and on something like George Floyd, he issued a statement afterwards saying, silence is death, like very much in line. And he knew from personal experience because he had been silent so long himself. But the lesson there for younger people, I think, is maybe tolerance of those of us who are a little older and maybe slower to adopt some of these new values. I'm not talking about the excesses of wokeism, but sort of the legitimate part of it. And he he shows that better late than never. Like you can come to a consciousness of this new world when you're older.
We can, if somebody wants to ask about the 1976 campaign, they can. It's an incredibly great topic, but I want to talk about the Camp David Accords and the Panama Canal. As people are doing the fast trip through the Carter presidency, they often talk about those two things as his great achievements. Is that the way you see it? And pick whichever one of the two of those you want to add a little color to.
Well, I want to first pick a third one because Jimmy Carter believes his longest lasting achievement is something that almost nobody pays attention to. There's another biography that came out sometime after mine, which is quite good in many ways, but he deals with this subject in 2 sentences, and I have a whole chapter on it, and that is normalization of relations with China.
Yes.
And so you think, okay, Nixon did that, right? Nixon opened the door to China. But Carter normalized relations. And if Gerald Ford had been elected in that 70, it would have, because he had Reagan on his right, it could have been years before we normalized relations with China. Now you go, is that big of a deal? Actually, yes. So after he leaves Washington, Deng Xiaoping, he signs this deal with Carter, goes back to China. What's the first thing he does the next week? He legalizes private property. And the global economy, which is basically based on this bilateral relationship. If you look at the numbers, the global economy, the trade relationship between China and the US is the foundation of it, which is why when Trump just recently said he wants to end trade with China, it's like, okay, just crater the entire global economy while you're at it. This is something that it might have eventually happened, but it was very impactful. And Carter's attention to detail, which in all 3 of these things, China, Panama Canal, and Camp David, he was much maligned for being a micromanager. But it was this understanding that the devil was in the details that led to all 3 of these agreements. So just very quickly on Camp David and Panama Canal. Camp David Accords, they brought peace between Israel and Egypt. They had fought 4 wars in the previous 30 years, including one just 4 years earlier. And they haven't had a shot fired in anger. So Carter is the only Democratic president who didn't carry the Jewish vote in 1980. And he's the most pro-Palestinian president by far that we've ever had. But he is the greatest president for the security of the state of Israel since Harry Truman and the founding of that state, because the Egyptian army was the only army with the capacity to destroy Israel. And it's been off the table since 1978. And that then became the foundation of what they call the Mideast peace process, the Camp David Accords. On the Panama Canals, which I was not interested in at all before I started this, I didn't think I was going to do a whole chapter on it. It felt kind of musty and boring to me. So 2/3 of the country is against ratifying the Panama Canals and turning over the canal to the Panamanians. Ronald Reagan is making his political career in his opposition to it. It requires a 2/3 approval vote in the US Senate, the heaviest of heavy lifts in the Senate. 5 senators lost their seats by voting with Carter on these. The Joint Chiefs said that if Carter hadn't done this, and his wife is telling him, do it in the second term, it's so unpopular, don't do this. If he hadn't done it, we would have had a Vietnam guerrilla war on our doorstep in perpetuity, and that it would have required, according to the Joint Chiefs, 100,000 American troops stationed permanently in Panama, protecting the canal because it's the artery of global commerce. So the stakes on this were immense. And Carter worked across the aisle. He got Howard Baker to come along with him. And he had plenty of problems with Congress, but I was more struck by his successes with Congress.
And he used to say the problems he had with Congress were more from his own side than
Yes.
working with somebody like Howard
That is
Baker.
true. His biggest, when I discussed this with him, he said that his biggest mistake as president is that he did not manage relations inside the Democratic Party.
And let's go to that quickly because it gets to the micromanaging piece. I mean, he came in sort of ignoring the Democrats, and I guess for somebody who was as much of a planner, who understood the politics of Georgia and some of the things he needed to do that were objectionable and he might not have wanted to do, was his misread of his own party, where do you put that in the failures of the Carter presidency? Because he had a lot of work to do after he first misread those Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, he did things like killing their water projects and just things, put a finger in their eye on various things. And he can be a very diffident, prickly person. And he didn't think of himself as a politician. He was great at getting elected, but he thought then when you're elected, the politics should end, do the right thing, even if it's unpopular, that's what they're paying you for. And he didn't really like hanging out with members of Congress, right? So where this was most costly, there were some bills like, for instance, your own Russell Long, right? He was the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, and Carter wanted to reform the tax code. In the campaign, he'd call it a disgrace. And he wanted a totally simplified tax code that I think all of us would support. But he designed it without consulting Russell Long. And Russell Long, like, ate him for lunch. Like, he said, like, if he'd bothered to talk to me about this beforehand, maybe we could have had a bill, but screw it now. And they killed it and then just cut capital gains like the Republicans wanted to, which actually helped with the boom in the 1980s, but that's another story. But then particularly on health care, so he did not manage his relationship with Ted Kennedy. And they not only didn't get health care when they could have, and by the way, Kennedy shares a lot of the blame for this, but it was the president's job to manage that relationship. And he did such a poor job at that. They were like oil and water that Kennedy challenged him for the nomination. And even though Carter won, that was one of, along with the Iran hostage crisis and, double-digit inflation and interest rates, those things all doomed Carter's presidency, and he was swamped by events. But that was an important factor. It wasn't the only factor. Just to tell you a quick story. So Paul Volcker, who I interviewed not long before his death and was the chair of Federal Reserve, some people said, and I said this to him, some people say you re-elected Ronald Reagan because Carter knew he was going to raise interest rates, appointed him anyway because he wanted to do something about inflation, and sure enough, interest rates go up over 15%, but the harsh medicine doesn't work until Reagan is president, and then that tees up inflation-free economic growth that gets Reagan reelected. So Carter and Volcker are at a fishing lodge together. They both like to go fly fishing. And Volcker, who's a big admirer of Carter's, goes up to him and says, I'm really sorry if I cost you the presidency. And Carter smiled with one of his genuine smiles and said, Paul, there were many factors. And I think that's accurate.
I'm going to try and squeeze in two questions before I allow the rest of the room to ask questions. One is on the question of lying. Jimmy Carter said, I will never lie to you. You've also written about FDR, who was very good at lying and knew how to use lying, and you could make the case, and I feel like I felt this after reading your book, that lying in the right way at the right time is an essential quality of being president. Do you buy that? And was Jimmy Carter's not lying, while it was an effective campaign tactic, crucial in the post-Watergate era, the post-Church Committee era, the post-Vietnam era, that nevertheless, as a governing matter, not lying is not as wonderful a thing as I'm not talking about with respect to Trump, who lied constantly.
Yeah. So I do think you can be president without telling whoppers, what we call 5 Pinocchios. The Washington Post has this thing. Carter's problem was TMI, what we would now call TMI. So one day he came down with a very severe case of hemorrhoids. And I'm going to tell, it's a little bit off-color remark I'm going to make here. So he had to miss work. And there had to be, some explanation, like what the president is doing today. And so the press off, Jody Powell, his press secretary, said, well, we'll make up some excuse. And Carter said, no, tell them the truth, that I'm sidelined with, he thought, if they didn't know what the president was doing and he was AWOL, markets would go down or whatever, he thought it was irresponsible not to say why he was not being an active president. And so they told the truth, and they issued a statement saying the president is suffering from hemorrhoids. And Sam Donaldson, who was a famous shouter, you remember him from when he was an ABC News correspondent, he shouts across the White House driveway at Jerry Rafshoon, the communications director, "Jerry, how was the president's asshole today?" And and so, there was just a little bit, so, but I don't think you have.
And they ask that now at every press conference. Right. It's really a standard the presidency has come to embrace.
And so I don't, and he would do that. He would also exaggerate some. So he didn't lie, but he was a serial exaggerator, like most politicians. He wasn't humble. No politician is humble.
Right.
But what he is, and continues to be, is modest. And a lot of people thought that shrunk the presidency. So I think that he stopped playing Hail to the Chief. Then he started again, because they realized eventually something that Carter didn't understand, which is that the presidency is a theater. And obviously Reagan understood it very well. Yeah. You have to perform in the theater of the presidency to lead. And he just wasn't very good at that stylistically. So he's a political and stylistic failure, but a substantive and often far-sighted success on a variety of issues, including human rights, climate change, all kinds of things we don't have time to talk about. But this was in many ways, a visionary American president who, I was just thinking about it with this Palestine, Ohio thing. So there's a huge toxic waste site, right? It wasn't until Carter that there was any money to clean up toxic waste sites. It wasn't until Carter that there was any support for green energy from the federal government, or not, of course he put the solar panels on the roof of the White House. And this really amazed me. It wasn't until Carter, and no reporters even remember this. They were so busy writing stories about him being attacked by a killer rabbit or collapsing in a road race or something like that. It was the first time that public utilities were incentivized to produce clean energy. So these are big structural things that are happening in the United States under his leadership, but he in some ways wasn't a leader, because when he turned around, there was nobody behind him.
I have to kill my second question, or there's not going to be any time
I'm
for
sorry.
No, it's quite all right, because I have 98 others, so it's okay to kill one. The microphones are right here, so step up and...
I was really wondering about the 1976 election.
Boom, there you go. Thank you very much. I only had to pay him $10 to do that.
Okay, so he goes from 0% in the polls to the White House, and mostly because he's coming after the Nixon-Ford administration, and was this breath of fresh air and healing. A lot of the same themes that Joe Biden struck in his recent campaign, but unlike Biden, he was an outsider, and that made him seem very fresh. And also, he was a brilliant retail candidate, and they figured out that the Iowa caucuses could be meaningful. Because he was unemployed, he couldn't run for re-election as governor of Georgia. He could just park himself in Iowa and literally campaign person to person. And at one point, like, he came upon a farmhouse and the farmer wasn't there, and he left him a note and said, "I'll come by later," and then went by later, and his Rosalind, who's a tremendously formidable person, and when my book came out, I heard from somebody, they had listened to it on tape because Jimmy Carter can't see anymore after a fall that he had, and so they listened to it on Audible or Amazon Audio. Simon & Schuster Audio. So Rosalind's response to my book was, "Well, Jonathan had some very critical things to say about Jimmy, but he only said nice things about me." And that was true, because she's so formidable. And the reason I bring her up in this...
But you mean she's so formidable and you were worried she was going to come after you?
That too. And she, as I mentioned yesterday, she gave me his love letters to her, which are fantastically interesting.
They sure
But
are.
I mention her in this 1976 context because he would not have been governor or president if it were not for Rosalind Carter. And others in his family, including his enormously colorful mother, who was on Johnny Carson all the time in this period, they helped a lot too. She'd just come back from the Peace Corps, and his mother, but Rosalind was his, not only his central political advisor, but on policy. She was very, very important. And she got through the first mental health legislation this country's ever had in the fall of 1980, which Reagan defunded, and then it came back under Obama, but whole series of other contributions also in the post-presidency period.
And yet he didn't tell her when he was running for Senate for the first time that he was running.
Right, yeah, he was on a learning curve with her.
Yeah, two things. The process of selecting and then withdrawing Ted Sorensen and the October, for head of CIA, and the October surprise.
So his original choice for CIA director was Ted Sorensen, and it ran into a buzzsaw on Capitol Hill because it turned out Sorensen had been who was Kennedy's top aide, had been a conscientious objector during World War II, and Joe Biden, who was the first senator to endorse Jimmy Carter and stayed loyal to him, supported him against Kennedy, who had helped him when his wife and daughter died. And Biden stayed loyal to him generally, but on Sorensen, he was among those senators who told him to pull the nomination. And Carter listened, but as Rosalind later told me, we should have brought it up for a vote because it looked like we could get rolled very early on in the Carter administration. That sent a bad signal to Capitol Hill that they abandoned the Sorensen nomination. On the October surprise, this is a rabbit hole that I go a little ways down, but the indications are that that William Casey, who was Reagan's campaign manager, did meet in Madrid with representatives of the Ayatollah in the summer of 1980, and they cut a deal to delay the release of the hostages until Reagan was president. But it can't be definitively proven. But there's a whole fascinating story that involves the Rockefellers and Carter's worst decision, which was letting the Shah of Iran into the United States for medical treatment, where they conned him into believing that the Shah couldn't be treated in a Mexican hospital. And there's a quite colorful story involving Iran that I cover in detail in the book.
Thank you.
These are going to have to be the last two questions, and so
I'll try to go
carry on,
fast.
Teddy.
So in 2003, I went to Jimmy Carter's presidential library and was struck at the time by his pages and pages of handwritten notes because it seemed like such a contrast to the president at the time in 2003, who didn't seem like he gave that much thought to many things. But how did you, as a biographer, reckon with sort of just those pages and pages of documentation of his presidency by him?
So, you know, those are important, and I read a lot of them. Actually, he didn't write as many handwritten notes as George H.W. Bush, who they say hand-wrote his way to the presidency. He wrote so many thank you notes. But there are quite a number by Carter. A lot of them were pretty pro forma, although I like those, for instance, the ones he wrote to Muhammad Ali when he was trying to get Ali to help him get the hostages released. Those were really interesting. A lot of the others, more pro forma, and his diary entries were of more use to me. But, you know, as Robert Caro says about LBJ, who's been spending 40 years on, more than 40 years, you can't turn every page. It doesn't matter how long you're there. There's so many millions of pages that you have to learn to kind of figure out what you're looking for. And then some things you do get by serendipity, where you'll see letters that you weren't looking for. And this is a problem with Obama's library, which is going to be mostly online, where you really have to know what you're looking for. When it's handwritten or in document form, you make these discoveries that you wouldn't have seen before. And that's going to be a serious loss for historians in the future. Yeah. Hi, Dave.
Hey, John.
Dave is my old Newsweek colleague.
You mentioned the most recent past president and Camp David, two things unrelated, which let me ask you two questions. One I've asked you already. Will the 45th president attend the funeral of the 39th? And some years ago, in the Proust questionnaire, the back page of Vanity Fair, Ed Koch, just before he died, was asked, who is the person you most despise?
Yeah.
And he answered Jimmy Carter.
Yeah.
What do you have to say about those?
So on the first one, no, I don't think Trump will be invited to Carter's funeral for a lot of reasons that you can probably predict. Although, you know, Carter invited Nixon, I was talking about China, he invited Nixon to the White House for the first time since he resigned when Deng Xiaoping was visiting, and Carter believes in forgiveness, so I don't actually know his instructions. He might invite Trump, actually. I'm going to revise that answer. I think he may have left instructions, I simply don't know, although I am in pretty close contact right now with what's going on in Plains and could probably find out. And he had some contact with Trump early in the Trump presidency. Trump called him to talk about China, and they had a good conversation. But then later, Carter said publicly that Trump had his connections with the Russians had rigged the election in 2016. So I think Trump, who has a long memory, probably won't show, even if he's invited. Ed Koch was disloyal to Jimmy Carter because he didn't trust him on Israel. And I knew Ed Koch quite well, and when he loved this kind of feuding, and he betrayed Carter, as did the mayor of Chicago, Jane Byrne, who was Jamie and my mother's arch rival in Chicago politics. Both of them had endorsed Jimmy Carter in 1980, and then they switched to Kennedy. And you don't do this in politics. And Hamilton Jordan, this is a, trigger warning, this is not a woke joke. But Hamilton Jordan later said, that was Jimmy Carter's top aide, said that if Ed Koch and Jane Byrne had a baby, it would have every quality of a dog except loyalty. So I think that gives you some idea of the relationship between Jimmy Carter and Ed Koch. And also the relationship with Bill Clinton was also very fraught, although at their 77th wedding anniversary in the summer of 2021, which my wife and I attended in Plains, Bill and Hillary Clinton came to that event, which was a sign that their very tangled relationship has been resolved in a positive way.
Jonathan Alter, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions.